The officer slammed the door shut after handcuffing the man and still hadn't asked his name. What he didn't know, that man was his new chief of police. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if this story speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The officer's hand rested on the top of his holster as he stepped out of his patrol car. Blue lights spun across the quiet suburban street. A sleek black Mercedes was parked by the curb, engine still running. Officer Brent narrowed his eyes, adjusting his belt. He hadn't seen a car like that in this neighborhood before, not driven by someone like the man behind the wheel. Dark-skinned, well-dressed, calm, too calm in his eyes. Brent approached slowly, tapping the side window with his knuckles. "Roll down the window," he said sharply. The man inside turned his head, his face unreadable, and lowered the window without a word. His eyes met Brent's, calm but not weak. Brent's tone grew firmer. "This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle. Step out of the car." The man raised his eyebrows slightly, almost surprised, but didn't argue. "I have the papers. Everything's legal. You can check the registration." His voice was even, not defensive. But Brent wasn't interested in documents. "Step out now. Hands where I can see them." Without resistance, the man opened the door and stepped out slowly. His name was Leon. His suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished. Everything about him spoke of control, of someone who didn't belong on the receiving end of flashing lights. Brent watched him like a threat, hands still hovering near his weapon. "Turn around. Hands on the roof." Leon obeyed. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He only glanced over at the quiet row of houses, where curtains shifted and faces peeked out. A boy across the street had stopped riding his bike and was now watching, eyes wide. A woman walking her dog paused, frowning. Brent patted him down roughly. No weapons, no drugs, nothing out of place. Still, he pulled out a pair of cuffs. "You're being detained for questioning." "For what?" Leon asked quietly without turning his head. "You haven't checked my ID. You haven't even looked at the license plate." Brent's lips curled. "We'll sort that out at the station." Leon's phone buzzed on the car's dashboard. A message lit up the screen, but Brent didn't notice. He was too busy pushing Leon toward the patrol car, too sure of his assumptions. Leon didn't resist, but as he was being guided to the back seat, his eyes met those of the boy across the street again. The boy's name was Aaron. Leon gave him a small nod as if to say, "It's okay," even though it wasn't. And no one watching had any idea who Leon really was. Officer Brent opened the back door of his patrol car and guided Leon down without force, but with the same cold control he'd shown since the stop began. Leon ducked his head and slid inside, keeping his posture upright, his face unreadable. Brent shut the door with a loud thud, then walked around to the front of the Mercedes. He pulled out his notepad and began copying the plate number, muttering under his breath. He hadn't radioed it in yet. In his mind, it was already settled. Across the street, Aaron was still frozen beside his bike. His mother, Rachel, had stepped outside now, arms folded tightly, her eyes locked on the scene. She didn't say anything, but her face showed a quiet anger. This wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this. The dog walker, an older woman named Barbara, shook her head and whispered to herself, "Unbelievable." Inside the car, Leon sat still. The cuffs weren't tight, but the humiliation cut deeper than the metal. He turned slightly, looking at his phone on the dashboard of his Mercedes. It buzzed again. Another message appeared. This one read, "Reminder, command staff briefing starts in 20 minutes. Brent glanced back at Leon through the rear window. He wasn't used to this kind of calm. Usually people in that back seat yelled, begged, or swore. Leon hadn't even raised his voice. That made Brent uneasy in a different way. He tapped the roof of the Mercedes with the edge of his flashlight, then finally grabbed his radio. "This is Unit 27, running a plate, black Mercedes, plate number 8XU-394. He paused as the dispatcher repeated the numbers back to him, then waited. The silence that followed was longer than he expected. Brent paced slowly, looking over the car again, trying to find something, anything, that would confirm his suspicion. Tinted windows, designer watch on the passenger seat, briefcase in the back. The kind of stuff that made him suspicious, though he couldn't explain why. The radio crackled. Unit 27, be advised, vehicle is registered to Leon Jennings. Address confirmed. No flags. Status is clear. Brent frowned, his fingers tightening on the radio. Say again? No reports? Affirmative. Vehicle is clean. Registered to Jennings, Leon. No warrants, no alerts. Brent stared at the car, his mouth slightly open. He looked back at Leon, who hadn't moved. Brent's hand dropped from his belt. Something about this didn't sit right, and for the first time a sliver of doubt crept in. But it came too late. The damage had already begun. Brent stood frozen for a few seconds, radio still in hand. The dispatcher's voice faded, but her words echoed in his mind. Vehicle is clean. Registered to Jennings, Leon. He wasn't expecting that. It didn't match the picture he had painted before even stepping out of his car. His instincts told him something was off, not with the car, but with how everything was playing out. He slowly walked back to his patrol car, casting a glance at the people gathering across the street. Aaron was now joined by his older sister, Mia, who stood beside their mother. Rachel had taken out her phone. Brent noticed the red light blinking. She was recording. His jaw clenched slightly, and he turned his focus back to Leon. Opening the door, Brent spoke with less bite than before. Step out. I'm going to check your license. Leon moved with quiet control, standing tall as he stepped out of the back seat. His eyes met Brent's, calm but sharp. He didn't say anything, just waited. Brent motioned for him to walk over to the passenger side of the Mercedes. Leon walked slowly, still cuffed, his steps even and precise. Brent followed, suddenly feeling like he was the one being observed. When they reached the car, Brent opened the door and grabbed Leon's wallet from the center console. No permission asked. He pulled out the ID and stared at it for a long time. Almost too long. Everything matched. Name, photo, address. Same as the registration. No mistakes. Brent looked up. What do you do for a living? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Leon answered without hesitation. I'm in law enforcement. Brent raised an eyebrow, skeptical. Yeah? What department? Leon looked him in the eyes. You'll find out soon enough. The words weren't said with anger, but they carried weight. Brent felt them settle like bricks in his chest. His radio buzzed again, but he ignored it. For the first time, a wave of discomfort passed through him, like the ground beneath his boots had shifted. He turned away from Leon and started walking back to his car again, trying to collect his thoughts. He could feel the stares behind him, the neighbors, the kids, the woman recording. All of them saw him slam a man in cuffs into the back of a patrol car, and now suddenly he was beginning to look wrong. Leon remained silent. He didn't ask to have the cuffs removed. He didn't raise his voice or demand anything. His silence said more than words could. It said he had been here before. It said he knew how people like Brent operated. It said, I knew this would happen. Brent's mind raced. What if he had overstepped? What if this man really was someone important? That thought hadn't crossed his mind earlier, and now that it had, it wouldn't let go. He felt something strange building, not fear exactly, but something close. Unease. Then a black SUV turned onto the street and pulled up behind Brent's patrol car. It moved smoothly, confidently, like it belonged there. Two men stepped out. Suits, earpieces, badges visible. Brent's stomach dropped. They walked straight toward Leon, not toward him. One of them gave a short nod. Sir, we were told you needed assistance. Brent's throat went dry. Leon finally spoke. Yes, I believe Officer Brent here had some confusion about who I am. The words weren't loud, but they hit like a hammer. Brent stood still, suddenly unsure of everything. The two men turned toward him. One showed a badge from Internal Affairs. The other didn't speak. He just watched. Rachel crossed the street now, her phone still recording. She stopped a few feet from Brent. You picked the wrong man today, officer, she said quietly. Brent said nothing. Leon turned slightly, his voice still calm. You should probably uncuff me now. And just like that, the shift Brent had feared was fully underway. Brent's hands hovered near his belt, but they weren't steady now. His fingers twitched slightly as his eyes darted between the two men in suits and the crowd that had nearly doubled in size. Neighbors had come out of their homes. Some were filming, others whispering, a few shaking their heads. There was no way to undo what had just happened, and Brent felt it, thick in the air, like heat before a storm. The taller of the two men stepped closer, eyes locked on Brent. His tone was polite, but firm. "Officer, remove the cuffs. Now." Brent hesitated. He looked at Leon, then back at the man. "Can I ask who you are?" The man lifted his badge slowly, letting Brent read it. His voice remained controlled. "I'm Agent Doyle, Internal Affairs. This man is not only a citizen with a clean record, he's your superior. You should be very careful with what you say next." Brent felt something in his chest twist. He turned to Leon, still standing straight, still quiet. Slowly, he reached for his keys and unlocked the cuffs. The metal clicked, and the restraints fell away. Leon rubbed his wrists lightly but didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Brent had already said more than enough with his actions. Leon stepped aside and faced the crowd now. His voice was clear and steady as ever. "You've all been very patient. I'm sorry you had to witness this." His eyes scanned the street, not with pride, not with anger, but with disappointment. "This isn't about me. This is about a system that too often forgets to ask questions before it makes judgments." Brent's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Everything he'd assumed was crumbling. He had judged Leon from the start, from his car, his suit, his silence. And now Leon stood there, not a suspect, but a man with authority. Authority that Brent never bothered to check. Agent Doyle stepped to the side and said something into his radio. Moments later, another unmarked vehicle turned onto the street. This one wasn't sleek. It was an older department SUV, but the man who stepped out wore his rank like a shadow. Short gray hair, firm jaw, clean uniform. The name tag said, Chief of Police. Brent's heart stopped. He had seen the chief in meetings, briefings, but never like this. The chief didn't even glance at him. He walked straight to Leon and extended his hand. "Sir, I'm sorry for the delay. We received your message." Leon shook his hand calmly. "Thank you. I wasn't expecting a welcome party, but I appreciate the response." Gasps rose from the crowd. Whispers grew louder. A few people had stopped recording, too stunned to keep their phones steady. Brent took one step back, then another. The weight in his chest turned to stone. He looked again at Leon, not just a department official, not a detective, not a lieutenant. He was the new chief, his new chief. Leon turned to Brent now. His voice wasn't raised, but it had an edge. "You ran my plates. You ignored the results. You cuffed me without cause. You never asked for ID. You made a choice based on how I looked." Brent swallowed hard. I thought the car was suspicious. I didn't recognize you." Leon tilted his head slightly. "You don't need to recognize someone to treat them with respect." The street had gone quiet. No one moved. The only sound was the breeze brushing through the trees. "I've spent my life working my way up through this department," Leon continued. "And even now, wearing this suit, holding this title, you still saw me as a threat first. That tells me everything I need to know." Brent tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. His badge suddenly felt heavier than it ever had. The chief gave Leon a respectful nod. "Would you like us to handle this internally, or—" Leon didn't answer right away. He looked at Brent for a long moment, then turned his eyes to the people watching, especially the kids, Aaron and Mia, still standing with their mother. His decision, whatever it would be, wasn't going to be just about Brent. Not anymore. Leon stepped forward slowly, his shoes pressing against the pavement with purpose. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the crowd one more time. The weight of every eye was on him, some waiting for justice, others unsure of what they were witnessing. His silence had carried strength earlier, but now his voice would carry the lesson. He looked back at Brent. "What's your badge number, officer?" Brent's mouth opened, then shut again. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. 7359. Leon nodded slowly. "That number will be remembered." Brent looked down. His hands were clenched, the confidence drained from his face. Sweat had begun to collect along his collar. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. especially not by someone he'd assumed didn't belong. Leon continued, his voice steady. You assumed I stole this car. You didn't even check the facts before you put cuffs on me. You searched me without consent. You put me in the back of your cruiser like a criminal while my ID sat right there on the dashboard. Brent tried to speak. I thought, no, Leon cut in. You didn't think. You judged. And that's the problem. The wind picked up slightly. The only other sound was a dog barking faintly in the distance, and the quiet shuffle of neighbors adjusting their footing. No one dared interrupt. Leon's gaze moved past Brent, landing on Rachel, who was still recording. I appreciate you, he said to her, and she lowered her phone slowly. People like you are why this has to be talked about, not filmed for views, but understood for truth. Rachel nodded quietly. It's not the first time I've seen something like this, she said, her voice calm but laced with pain. But it's the first time I've seen someone like you stand tall through it. Leon gave her a respectful nod before turning to Agent Doyle. I want an official report filed, detailing the stop, the actions, the failure to verify, everything. Doyle didn't hesitate. Already in motion, sir. Leon looked back at Brent once more. This isn't about ruining your career, Officer Brent. It's about making sure the next man who looks like me doesn't get shoved into a back seat before his name is even spoken. Brent's shoulders dropped. There was no defense left in him, no excuse that could unwrite what just happened. His training hadn't prepared him for this, not the procedure, not the shame, not the power of being exposed in broad daylight for what it was. Leon took a step back, glancing at the unmarked SUV. I'll be at headquarters in 10. Let the command staff know I'll expect a full briefing on today's operations, plus a separate meeting regarding street-level conduct. The chief of police nodded. Understood, sir. Leon turned toward the Mercedes and opened the driver's door. The scent of leather and faint cologne met him. His phone, still resting on the dashboard, buzzed again. He picked it up. Another message from the department. All set for 9 a.m. We're ready for your first address as chief. He slid into the seat and started the engine. The car purred softly, smooth and controlled, just like him. He didn't look back at Brent. He didn't have to. The silence behind him said it all. As the Mercedes pulled away from the curb, the crowd parted. People watched him go, not just as a man wrongfully detained, but as a man who held his ground without raising his voice. A man who exposed a system without lifting a finger. A man who had changed something, maybe small, maybe huge, but something that would ripple through every badge on that street. And Brent? He stood there, still frozen, surrounded by eyes that once trusted him, but now those same eyes saw everything differently. And so did he. The Mercedes turned the corner and disappeared from view, but the impact Leon left behind remained like a weight pressing down on the street. People began to move again, quietly, slowly, like they had just witnessed something they didn't quite know how to explain. Brent stood near his cruiser, his arms slack by his sides, his face pale. He could feel the weight of their stares. None of them were loud, but none of them looked away either. That silence hit harder than any outburst would have. Agent Doyle was speaking into his earpiece, noting the timeline, confirming the incident log. The second agent stood near the patrol car, arms crossed, his eyes still fixed on Brent. Not in anger, just with a cold, professional stillness that made Brent feel even smaller. Rachel crossed the street with her kids beside her. She stopped a few feet from Brent. You didn't even ask his name, she said, not angry, just stating a fact. You saw a black man in a nice car and assumed he was a thief. That's the problem. Brent tried to say something, but she had already turned and walked away. The boy Aaron looked back once before following his mother. That look stayed with Brent. It wasn't just disappointment, it was confusion, the kind that sinks into a child's memory and stays there for life. The chief of police approached, his expression unreadable. You're lucky, he said to Brent, his voice low. If he had been anyone else, you'd be under suspension already. But he's not just anyone. Brent raised his eyes. I didn't know who he was. The chief narrowed his gaze. That's the point. He handed a folded slip of paper to Agent Doyle. Full incident review. I want your report on my desk by morning. and I want this officer's conduct evaluated." Doyle nodded. "Already done." The chief turned back to Brent. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "You didn't just embarrass yourself. You put this department in a position we may not recover from easily. The cameras were out. People were filming. People were watching. And what they saw was a man abused by someone who never even checked the truth before acting." Brent's mouth was dry. It wasn't personal. "Everything becomes personal when you carry that badge," the chief said, pointing to Brent's chest. "You made it personal the moment you grabbed him without cause." Brent looked away. A few more neighbors were leaving now, shaking their heads. He heard one of them mutter, "Typical," and another whisper, "Unbelievable." He thought he could just get away with it. In all his years on the force, Brent had never felt like this. He had written up reports. He had stopped people before. He had followed instinct more than once. But this was different, because this wasn't about one stop. This was about everything he had ignored. Every shortcut, every assumption. Every time he'd let his own bias sit quietly in the corner of his judgment. And now that bias had dragged him into the open. He looked down at his hands. They still felt the echo of those cuffs. Not on Leon's wrists, but on his own conscience. Agent Doyle stepped forward, his voice breaking Brent's thoughts. "We'll be contacting you for a formal interview. You're free to return to your vehicle for now, but don't leave town. We're not done." Brent nodded slightly but didn't move. His cruiser sat behind him like a cold wall. Everything that had once felt like power now felt like paper. Thin, fragile, meaningless. Up the block, Rachel reached her front steps and turned around once more. She watched Brent for a second, then went inside, closing the door behind her. The street returned to silence. But Brent knew this wasn't the kind of silence that faded. This was the kind that settled into the bones of a place, the kind that left marks. And he had just become the reason for it. Brent sat in the front seat of his cruiser, motionless, staring through the windshield without really seeing anything. The engine was off, but the weight of everything around him kept humming in his ears. The words, the silence, the stares, the quiet judgment that had filled the street like smoke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steering wheel, and exhaled slowly. The taste of regret sat bitter on his tongue. He reached for his notepad, then stopped. There was nothing he could write that wouldn't feel like a lie. His body was still in uniform, but it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a mirror, one that had just exposed who he truly was, not only to the people outside, but to himself. He replayed every moment from the stop, the way Leon had looked at him. Never angry, never shaken, just steady, composed. That was what bothered him most. Leon hadn't fought back. He hadn't begged or panicked. He had watched Brent undo himself, silently, slowly, step by step. Brent closed his eyes for a second. His radio crackled again with routine updates, unrelated calls from across the district. But he didn't reach for it. His hand rested near it out of habit. But his mind wasn't with the job anymore. It was stuck back on the sidewalk, where he had forced a man to turn around, hands on the car, without even asking for ID. Without even thinking for a second that the man might belong right where he was. A knock on his window startled him. He looked up. It was Officer Kelly, mid-30s, soft-spoken, usually working traffic. She stood with her brow furrowed, concern on her face. Brent rolled down the window. "You good?" she asked quietly. Brent nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I'm fine." She looked past him toward the street. He was the new chief, wasn't he? Brent didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Kelly stepped back. "They're already talking about it back at the station. Dispatch heard the name on the radio, and it spread fast. Internal Affairs is pulling the body cam footage. I think you know that." Brent leaned back, his head against the seat. "Yeah, I know." Kelly stood there for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "You might want to head in. Command's probably going to want to speak with you. Sooner than later." He nodded again, but didn't move. Kelly hesitated, then turned and walked back to her car. Brent remained seated, now alone again, with nothing but the dull ache of realization sinking deeper and deeper. He had always seen himself as a decent cop. Not perfect, but solid. He'd gone by gut instinct more times than he could count. Told himself he was doing his job, following his training. But today had shattered that image. Today, the uniform didn't shield him from his actions. It magnified them. His mind drifted to Leon's last words before getting in his car. You don't need to recognize someone to treat them with respect. It kept echoing, over and over, like a sentence carved into concrete. Brent looked into the rearview mirror, but what stared back wasn't familiar. It was someone exposed, someone cracked open by truth. He rubbed his face with both hands, then started the engine. The cruiser came to life, but the confidence he used to feel behind the wheel didn't return with it. He didn't put the car in drive right away. Instead, he looked out the window at the empty sidewalk, now clear of bystanders, clear of eyes, except his own. The street was quiet again, but for Brent, nothing was quiet anymore. Every second of that stop would live in his memory, in his record, and now, in his reputation. And that was just the beginning. Brent pulled into the precinct's rear lot nearly an hour later, but he didn't get out right away. The building stood tall and still, same as always, but today it felt like it was waiting for him, with questions, with eyes, with consequences. His hands rested on the steering wheel long after the engine was off. The weight of what had happened hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier with every turn of the tires on the way back. He finally stepped out, adjusting his belt and straightening his vest like routine might hide what he carried. But nothing felt routine anymore. He walked through the side entrance, past the break room, past the bulletin board plastered with department updates and birthday notices. Conversations hushed as he entered. A few officers looked up from their desks. Some gave polite nods. Others didn't look at him at all. He felt the difference in the air immediately. The room was colder, tighter, like people weren't sure whether to stand with him or step away. At his desk, he barely had time to sit before the sergeant appeared beside him, a clipboard in one hand, his voice low and clipped. "Captain wants to see you. Now." Brent nodded. "Yeah, I figured." He stood and followed down the hallway. Every step felt like it echoed louder than it should. The door to the captain's office was already open. Captain Ruiz stood inside, arms crossed, face blank. On the desk was a folder with Brent's name labeled across the top. "Sit," she said, motioning toward the chair. Brent did. He didn't try to speak, not yet. Ruiz picked up the folder, flipped it open. "You want to tell me what happened today?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I stopped a man in a high-end vehicle. The neighborhood didn't match the car. His behavior was unusual." Ruiz closed the folder and stared at him. "Unusual?" Brent adjusted in his seat. He didn't argue, didn't panic. He was calm, too calm. It felt off. "And you cuffed him?" "Yes." "Without confirming identity?" Brent's voice dropped. "I made a judgment call." Ruiz leaned forward. "That man was your chief, your new chief. And you put him in handcuffs on a public street, in front of children, neighbors, and God knows how many cell phone cameras, without even checking his ID. "I didn't know who he was," Brent said, though even he was tired of hearing the words leave his mouth. "That's not the problem," Ruiz said, her voice sharp. "The problem is, you didn't care who he was. You decided what he was based on, how he looked. That is not how this department is supposed to operate." Brent looked down at the edge of the desk. His reflection blinked back from the polished surface. "I didn't mean for it to go that way." "But it did," she said bluntly. "And now we have a serious issue. The chief isn't pressing charges, for now, but he's ordered an internal review. IA is already pulling footage. You're going to be interviewed, and depending on how that goes, there may be disciplinary action." Brent nodded silently. He had expected that much. Ruiz continued. "I've been doing this job a long time. I've seen mistakes, bad calls. But this wasn't about training or procedure. This was personal judgment. And that's the kind of thing that stains not just your record, but ours." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Ruiz leaned back in her chair. "Do you realize what this means for him? He walks into this building knowing one of his own tried to criminalize him within an hour of taking leadership. You didn't just embarrass yourself. You embarrassed the badge." The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Brent felt it wrap around him like a tight rope, leaving no room to move. "You're on administrative leave," she said finally. Effective immediately. Turn in your badge and weapon before you leave. He stood slowly. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now felt like lead in his pocket. He unpinned it, set it down gently on the desk, followed by his holstered weapon. The sound of metal against wood was dull, but final. As he turned to leave, Ruiz spoke one last time. If you want to wear that badge again, you better start seeing the people in front of you, not just the story you tell yourself about them. Brent didn't respond. He walked down the hallway, past officers who watched him in silence, some with pity, others with quiet judgment. When he reached the locker room, he stood for a moment, staring at the walls, the shelves, the uniforms hanging neatly. Then he sat on the bench, elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. Everything had changed, and this time, there was no siren to drown it out. Leon sat at the head of the long, polished table in the department's main conference room. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting soft lines across the surface. But the mood inside the room was far from calm. Around him sat the senior staff, division heads, internal affairs officers, and command personnel, each with their files, tablets, and stiff expressions. The room was silent as Leon reviewed the last page of the printed incident report, the report that described how, only hours earlier, he was handcuffed on the side of the road by one of the very men who now fell under his command. He set the papers down slowly and looked up, his expression composed but unreadable. "I want to start by saying I didn't come here looking for respect," he said. His voice was steady, neither cold nor soft, just clear. "I came here to lead, to bring change to a department that needs it, and today that mission was tested earlier than expected." No one interrupted. A few shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but all eyes remained on him. "I didn't plan on being stopped in the street. I didn't plan on being treated like a suspect before my name was even spoken. But I'm not surprised," Leon continued. "That kind of treatment didn't begin today. It's been happening long before I put on a badge. Long before any of us wore these uniforms." He paused for a moment, letting the truth settle in the room. No anger in his tone, only truth. "I'm not here to ruin careers. I'm here to fix the culture, and that starts with accountability." Officer Brent made assumptions. He acted without confirming facts. He escalated a situation that never needed to happen. He turned judgment into procedure. That's a problem. He turned slightly to look at Captain Ruiz, who sat quietly at the side of the table. "Thank you for handling the internal side quickly. I've seen your report. The leave is appropriate for now?" Ruiz nodded once, her face solemn. Leon looked back at the room. "But let's not pretend this is about one man. Brent didn't act in a vacuum. His behavior reflects what this department has tolerated, maybe not openly but silently. And silence is complicity." The air in the room grew heavier. No one argued. A few looked down. A few stared straight ahead. "I want new training protocols in place within 30 days, Leon said. "Bias recognition, procedural integrity, communication, real training, not checkboxes. And every officer, from rookie to command, will attend, including me." Heads nodded slowly around the table. They knew he wasn't making a suggestion. He was giving a directive. Leon leaned forward slightly. "We don't get to hide behind, 'I didn't know who he was.' That excuse is over. Because it shouldn't matter who someone is. Every person we stop deserves the same level of respect. No exceptions." He let the silence linger. "I'll be addressing the entire department tomorrow. Not with a lecture, with expectations. The badge should never become a shield for bias, and I will not allow this department to rot from the inside while wearing the mask of order." The conference room door opened quietly, and a staff member stepped in, handing Leon a folder. He thanked her, opened it, and scanned the contents. After a moment, he looked up again. "One more thing. Officer Brent requested a meeting. He's in the building. Says he wants to speak face to face. I'm considering it." A few people shifted. A few exchanged uncertain looks. "I don't need an apology," Leon said plainly. "But I'm curious whether he realizes what this really was. If it's guilt or if it's growth." He stood, gathering his files. "Either way, this department changes today, and whether they like it or not, they're coming with me." He walked out, leaving the command staff to sit with the truth he had just laid bare. Down the hallway, a knock came at a small interview room door. Brent sat inside, hands folded, dressed in plain clothes. He looked up as the door opened, and Leon walked in. Brent stood the moment Leon entered the room. He hadn't been told when, or even if, the chief would come. He'd been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, his thoughts bouncing between shame and the urge to justify what had happened. But now, as Leon closed the door behind him and walked calmly to the chair across the table, Brent's voice left him. Leon didn't sit right away. He studied Brent for a second, not with judgment, but with the quiet observation of a man who had already seen everything he needed to. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down, back straight, hands clasped in front of him. The room was small, no windows, just 4 walls, a table, and 2 chairs. The kind of room used for questioning, for truth. Fitting. Brent cleared his throat. "Chief, I want to say," Leon raised one hand, not angrily, just firmly. "Before you speak, I want you to understand something. I didn't come here to be convinced." Brent nodded quickly. "Understood." There was a beat of silence. Leon's voice, when he finally spoke again, was quiet but carried weight. "Why?" Brent blinked. "Sir? Why did you stop me? Don't tell me about procedure. Don't hide behind training. I'm not interested in the policy. I want your answer." Brent looked down at the table, searching for the right words. Words that wouldn't sound hollow, wouldn't sound like excuses. But the truth had already sat with him long enough to be undeniable. "I saw a black man in a suit, in a car I couldn't afford," he said slowly, almost ashamed to hear himself say it aloud. "I assumed it wasn't his, that he didn't belong in that neighborhood, that something was off. I didn't think twice. I didn't even check the plates before I pulled the door open." Leon didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised, just listened. Brent went on, his voice heavier now. "I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel like you were a threat. But I treated you like one anyway, because that's what I've gotten used to. That feeling that someone doesn't fit, doesn't look right, and acting on it before asking why." Leon leaned back in his chair. "You've been on the force how long?" 12 years. In 12 years, how many times have you stopped someone for not looking like they belonged?" Brent hesitated. "I don't know. Too many, probably." Leon nodded slowly. "How many of them looked like me?" The answer was obvious, and Brent didn't even try to deny it. "Most." There was a pause. Not hostile, just full of truth. Leon folded his hands on the table. "When you looked at me, you didn't see a man with 20 years in this department. You didn't see a veteran or a leader. You didn't see someone who had spent his life cleaning up messes made by people just like you. You saw a thief. You saw a problem." Brent didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He let the words sink in. Leon's voice softened, but somehow carried even more force. "Do you know how many times I've been in your seat trying to fix the damage done by people who made the same assumptions? You're not unique, Officer Brent, but you are responsible." Brent nodded, his voice shaking slightly. I know I screwed up." Leon leaned forward. "It's not just about screwing up. It's about what you do after. You can't change what happened on that street. You can't erase those cuffs. You can't undo what those kids saw. But you can decide what kind of man you're going to be moving forward." Brent swallowed. "I want to be better. Not just for the job. For myself." Leon watched him for a long moment. "Good. Then start by listening. Because from here on, every word, every action, every decision you make will be watched. You're not invisible anymore. Now you're an example, whether you deserve to be or not." Brent nodded again, slower this time. "I'll take whatever comes." Leon stood. "You will. And if you're lucky, that includes the chance to earn back the trust you broke." He paused at the door. "But that's not up to me. That's up to every person who watched you act without thinking, and now waits to see if you actually mean the words you're saying." Without another word, he stepped out, leaving the door slightly open behind him. Brent sat back down, the air in the room feeling even heavier than before. But for the first time that day, he didn't feel defensive. He felt accountable. And that was the beginning of something else. Leon stepped out of the interview room and shut the door gently behind him. He didn't pause or look back. The conversation was done. He had given Brent what most wouldn't, a chance to face the truth directly, Not through a memo, not through suspension paperwork, but man to man. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about clarity, about saying what had gone unsaid in too many rooms for far too long. Down the hall, Agent Doyle was waiting near the corner, watching with quiet understanding. Leon gave him a nod, and Doyle fell into step beside him as they made their way toward the elevator. "You think he got the message?" Doyle asked quietly. Leon didn't answer right away. He pressed the elevator button and stared at the glowing numbers descending toward them. "He got something," he said finally. "What he does with it, we'll see." They stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. For a moment there was silence, just the hum of the elevator moving, the soft mechanical rhythm. Then Doyle spoke again. "You handled that better than most would have." Leon gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've had a lot of practice staying calm when I shouldn't have to." Doyle said nothing else. He didn't need to. The weight of that truth needed no response. When they stepped out onto the main floor, Leon was met by a few scattered staff members who quickly stood a little straighter when they saw him. Some looked uneasy, unsure how to approach him after what had happened that morning. Others gave respectful nods. No words, just acknowledgement. He didn't expect applause. He didn't want it. Respect for him wasn't about title, it was about consistency. He walked through the lobby and out the glass doors into the bright afternoon. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows on the pavement. His car, parked off to the side in the designated chief of police spot, gleamed quietly. But Leon didn't walk to it right away. Across the street was a small park, mostly empty except for a few benches and a playground. And on one of those benches sat a familiar face. Rachel, the woman who had recorded the entire stop earlier that morning. Her children, Aaron and Mia, were a few feet away, playing near the slide. Leon crossed the street slowly, without his usual formality. Rachel saw him coming and stood. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently. She shook her head. "Not at all. I figured you'd have a long day." Leon gave a soft laugh. "You're not wrong." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the kids climb and swing and laugh, like the weight of the world wasn't hanging nearby. Rachel finally spoke. "You handled that better than anyone could have. My kids. They've never seen someone like you in charge. That means something." Leon nodded. "They saw too much this morning." "They saw the truth," she replied, "but they also saw dignity, strength, not anger." He looked at her. "I was angry, still am, but anger doesn't fix anything unless it's guided. And those kids, they're watching every move, every word. I couldn't give them another example of power used the wrong way." Rachel looked toward her children. "Aaron asked me why the officer looked so scared after you told him who you were. You know what I said? Because he realized he was wrong too late." Leon didn't reply right away. His eyes stayed on the kids. "I want them to grow up in a city where they don't have to prove they belong, where they're not assumed guilty before they speak. That won't happen overnight, but maybe this morning push something forward." Rachel turned to him. "You really believe that?" "I have to," Leon said quietly. "Because if I don't, then what's the point of sitting in that office across the street?" She smiled, a sad but hopeful kind of smile. "You're going to make some people uncomfortable." "I'm counting on it," he replied. They stood a few minutes longer. No grand speeches, no headlines. Just two adults watching kids play on a warm afternoon, knowing the world was still hard, but maybe, just maybe, cracking in the right places. Before leaving, Leon handed Rachel a small card from his pocket. "Department's launching a new community advisory board. I want real people on it. People who know what it feels like to stand on that sidewalk." She took the card, looking at it thoughtfully. "I'll think about it." Leon smiled. "That's all I ask." He turned and walked back toward his car. This time, as he stepped into the vehicle, there were no flashing lights, no confrontation, no raised voices, just the quiet click of the door and the steady breath of a man who knew he had stood where it mattered, when it mattered. And now there was still work to do. Leon drove through the city in silence. No music, no distractions, just the steady rhythm of the engine and the sound of thoughts echoing in his mind. Streets he'd driven down 100 times looked different now. Maybe they hadn't changed, but something in him had. The events of the morning were no longer just a personal experience. They were a public moment, a line drawn in full view of the community he was now responsible for. He passed the corner of Maple and Fifth where, years ago, he had once been stopped by an officer for looking suspicious. Back then, he was a rookie in plain clothes, just trying to get home after a late shift. He laughed it off later, told himself it was a misunderstanding. But the truth? That moment had stayed with him, like all the others. Like the elevator where a woman clutched her purse tighter when he stepped in. Like the manager who followed him around a store when he was in college, before he ever wore a badge. And now, even after rising through every level of the department, after serving with integrity, after being appointed chief, it still happened. Cuffed on the side of the road by someone who didn't bother to ask a single question before assuming he was a criminal. But it wasn't just about that moment. It was about the hundreds of moments like it, the ones that didn't go viral, the ones that left no scars on the body, only quiet damage inside. This morning had exposed a wound far older than Brent's mistake, and the city had seen it, up close. Leon turned onto Oak Avenue, where City Hall stood tall between two rows of aged buildings. He parked at the rear entrance and walked in through a private corridor. The receptionist at the security desk stood immediately, surprised but composed. "Good afternoon, Chief." "Afternoon," Leon replied, offering a nod as he signed in. The mayor was waiting for him upstairs, along with the deputy mayor, city attorney, and a few key council members. The meeting hadn't been scheduled, but after this morning, no one wanted to wait. Word had spread quickly, not just among officers, but in the media. A few local outlets had picked up the story. Cell phone footage was circulating. People had questions. Leon stepped into the chamber without hesitation. The room quieted. The mayor, a sharp but measured man named Fletcher, gestured to a seat near the head of the table. "Leon, thanks for coming." Leon sat down without ceremony. "I assume we're here to talk about the incident." Fletcher nodded. "It's gaining traction. Reporters are calling. The footage is already on a few major pages, and the headline they're running with is exactly what you'd expect. New police chief wrongfully detained by own officer." Leon didn't blink. "It's accurate." The deputy mayor leaned forward. "Do you want us to issue a statement on your behalf?" "No," Leon said plainly. "I'll speak for myself. I don't need a press team to soften what happened." The councilwoman to his right, an older woman who had long pushed for police reform, watched him closely. "They'll want to know why you didn't press charges." "Because accountability isn't always about courtrooms," Leon answered. "It's about systems. That officer will face consequences. That's already happening. But the real issue isn't what he did. It's how many others think the same way and never get caught." Fletcher tapped his fingers on the table. "People are going to ask what you plan to do. You've got the momentum now." Leon looked him in the eye. "Then let's use it." He laid out a folder he'd brought with him. Inside was a detailed outline for a new department-wide initiative: training, review boards, public engagement protocols, and a full internal audit of traffic stop data from the past 5 years. Not just to check numbers, but to ask hard questions, patterns, profiles, decisions. I want transparency. I want the community to know what we're doing and why. No hiding behind procedures or union language. If we've made mistakes, we face them. The room was quiet for a moment. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That's going to make some people uncomfortable." Leon didn't hesitate. "Then they're in the wrong seats." The silence that followed wasn't opposition. It was realization. Everyone in that room knew the city had changed in the span of a single morning, not because of a policy shift or a protest, but because one man chose not to explode when everything inside him had every reason to. Instead, he had stood still, spoke clearly, and showed the entire city what power looked like when it was earned, not abused. Leon stood. "I'll hold a press conference tomorrow morning. I'll take questions. I'll face criticism. But I won't run from it." Fletcher gave a small nod. "We'll be there." As Leon left the room, he passed by a junior staffer holding a tablet. She lowered it as he walked by and said quietly, "My little brother saw the video. He said he wants to be like you." Leon stopped for a second, then looked at her. "Tell him to be better than me." Then he walked out into the hallway, back into the sunlight, ready to face a city that had just been handed a mirror. And this time, he would make sure it didn't look away. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Leon reached home. The sky above the city bled shades of gold and orange, casting long, quiet shadows across the neighborhood. His street was peaceful. No reporters, no flashing lights, just the sound of wind nudging tree branches and a lawn sprinkler ticking rhythmically 2 houses down. It was the kind of calm that felt unfamiliar after a day that had been anything but. He parked in his driveway, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment. The silence inside the car was thick, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of reflection, of tiredness that wasn't physical, but deeply emotional. As he stepped out, the front door of the house opened, and a figure appeared in the doorway. Elise, his wife, stood there with a towel slung over her shoulder, her eyes searching his face. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. He approached slowly, and when he reached her, she simply opened her arms. He walked into the embrace without a word, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder, his breath catching for the first time since sunrise. "I saw the video," she said softly against his ear. "I saw all of it." Leon nodded against her, and they stood like that for a long moment, the doorway to their home holding more comfort than anything else in the world could. Inside, the house smelled of warm spices. Dinner sat waiting on the stove, untouched. Their teenage daughter, Alina, was in the living room, watching the same clip that had now been shared and reshared by thousands. When she noticed him, she muted the TV and stood. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from the quiet storm only a child feels when they see their parent reduced to a target. Leon crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "I'm okay," he said gently. "It's over." "No," Alina replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I hated the way he talked to you, like you didn't matter." Leon reached for her hands. "I've dealt with worse." "But you shouldn't have to," she said, her voice cracking. "Not when you've done everything right. Not when you're you." He looked at his daughter, her face so much like his own mother's, her spirit sharp and unshakable. "It's not about who I am. It's about what the world still refuses to see." She sat back down, frustrated. "So what now? What do we do? Just move on." Leon didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked over to the mantel above the fireplace, where framed photos told the story of his life. His academy graduation, his first promotion, the day he pinned his badge on a recruit he mentored, and more recently, the photo of him standing with the mayor during his appointment as chief. He picked up that last one, stared at it for a long moment. "We keep going," he said finally. "We tell the truth. Loudly, clearly. Over and over until the people who refuse to hear it have no choice but to face it." Elise stepped in, her voice low but steady. "You think they'll actually listen this time?" Leon placed the photo back and turned toward her. "Some won't, but some already are, and that's enough to keep pushing." He sat at the table, and they all joined him, not for the food, but for the grounding. The simple act of sitting as a family, breathing in the same air, was its own kind of healing. Later, as the house grew quiet and the street outside dimmed to a soft hush, Leon stood in his home office staring out the window. His phone buzzed beside him. Another message, another news update, another interview request. The footage had made national headlines. Commentators were weighing in, some praising his composure, others questioning the officer's future. The debate had begun, and it would keep spreading. But this wasn't about going viral. This wasn't a moment he would hang on a wall. This was personal. For every man who had been stopped for matching a description, for every woman who had clutched her keys a little tighter, walking past a patrol car, for every kid who had grown up knowing their silence was safer than speaking up. Leon picked up a pen and opened a blank notebook, not for a speech, not for a report, but for something more lasting, a record of what had happened and what needed to happen next, a plan that would outlive the headlines and exist long after the cameras disappeared. He began to write, slowly at first, then with purpose. We don't ask for power, we earn it. And when we get it, we use it to protect, not just bodies, but dignity. He paused, then wrote another line. Change doesn't begin with laws. It begins with moments, and this one belongs to all of us. Outside, the city turned quiet again. But Leon knew, this time silence wouldn't mean nothing was happening. This time silence would make room for something greater. The next morning arrived not with calm, but with anticipation. The city was awake earlier than usual, stirred not by alarm clocks, but by headlines and group chats, social media alerts, and quiet conversations around kitchen tables. On every local news channel, anchors spoke in carefully measured tones, repeating the same headline again and again. Police chief detained in racial profiling incident, department under scrutiny. Some viewers watched with anger, others with disbelief, but many watched with something else, a sense that finally someone in power had lived the same moment so many had faced without protection, without title, without the chance to speak up. At police headquarters, the press conference had been scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, but by 8:15, the briefing room was already filled. Reporters, city officials, department staff, community advocates, each person taking their seat with a mix of curiosity and tension. No one quite knew how the chief would address what had happened. Some expected cautious language, some expected deflection. Others, especially those who had followed his career closely, expected something more. At 8:58, Leon stood behind the podium at the front of the room, a simple black folder in his hands. He wasn't dressed in full uniform. Instead, he wore a dark gray suit, clean and sharp, but without the badges and pins of his position. That was intentional. Today wasn't about authority, it was about clarity. The room hushed the moment he looked up. He didn't begin with a greeting. He didn't thank the press for coming. He opened with truth. Yesterday, I was handcuffed in broad daylight, accused of stealing my own car, and treated like a threat before anyone bothered to ask who I was. Cameras flashed, pens moved, and silence deepened. I wasn't wearing a uniform. I wasn't surrounded by cameras or flashing lights. I was just a man, a black man, driving through a neighborhood. And that was enough to be stopped, questioned, and restrained. He let the words settle, unhurried, heavy. I didn't announce myself as chief. I didn't use my name to escape the cuffs. I waited. I stayed calm. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I knew that if I reacted the way most people would, the story today might have been very different. A few heads in the room lowered. He continued. What happened to me wasn't new. It wasn't rare. It wasn't shocking to the people who've lived it over and over again. The only reason this story is being told today is because of who I am. And that's exactly the problem. He paused not to gather his thoughts, but to make sure the room stayed with him. This department, our department, has a responsibility that extends beyond law enforcement. We are not here just to respond to crime. We are here to protect dignity, to reflect fairness, to make sure our actions match the values we claim to stand for. He flipped open the folder and pulled out a page. Effective immediately, I'm launching a new division within the department, Public Integrity and Trust. It will include civilian oversight, unfiltered access to body cam footage, and monthly reviews of department behavior across every precinct. Officers will be retrained, supervisors will be reassessed, and traffic stop data will be released publicly every quarter. Whispers rippled through the room. Some leaned forward. Others stiffened. Leon went on. This is not an attack on the badge. This is a reminder of what the badge is supposed to mean. Too many have treated it as armor, not responsibility. That ends now. He placed the page down, lifted his eyes again. Officer Brent has been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of a full review. He will face due process, just like any citizen would. And regardless of the review's result, one truth remains. He failed to treat another human being with basic respect. That is unacceptable. More cameras clicked. The words would be quoted in papers, looped on TV, picked apart in op-eds. He knew that. He didn't care. He stepped back slightly from the microphone. This is not about revenge. This is about repair. This is about the citizens who have long asked to be seen and the officers who have refused to look. A reporter raised her hand. Chief, are you concerned this may create division within the department? Leon looked at her, calm and firm. If honesty causes division, then the truth was never welcome to begin with. He stepped back again. I stand here not just as chief of police. I stand here as a man who knows what it feels like to be treated like less. I stand for those who never had a camera to capture their humiliation. And I promise this. I will not be the last voice to speak on this, but I will be the first in this department to act. He closed the folder, and then he stepped away. No grand exit, no need for applause, just quiet resolve, walking off a stage not built for comfort, but for accountability. Outside, as the press conference broadcast reached every corner of the city, people watched from barbershops, schools, city buses, living rooms, and phones at work. And for once, what they heard wasn't a cover-up or a spin. It was truth, and it was loud. The hours after the press conference passed like shifting waves. In some parts of the city, it was all people talked about, in offices, on sidewalks, in grocery store lines, and over dinner tables. In others, it was met with silence. Not the silence of apathy, but the kind that came with a tight chest and a lump in the throat. For many, especially in communities that had been stopped, searched, and sidelined for years, Leon's words hadn't just landed. They'd pierced. Not because they were poetic, but because they were honest. At the station, the mood had changed. Officers who once walked with a certain swagger now carried themselves differently, not with fear, but with caution, the kind that comes after being forced to look in the mirror. Some resented the shift. Others quietly welcomed it. And a few, especially the younger ones, finally felt like the department might become the place they'd hoped it would be when they first pinned on the badge. Meanwhile, across the city, in a small windowless room tucked deep in the Internal Affairs Division, Officer Brent sat in front of a plain desk, staring at a written notice of review. He had read it 3 times already, but the words didn't change. He knew the process that would follow. He'd watched others go through it. What he hadn't expected was how quiet everything felt now. The noise of justifying, defending, explaining. It was gone. And in that stillness, all that remained was understanding. He had crossed a line, and it was no longer about how sorry he felt. It was about what came next, with or without a badge. But far from that office, in a corner of the city that rarely made headlines, a different scene was unfolding. Rachel stood outside her son's school, waiting as Aaron came bounding down the steps with his backpack slung low and a paper clutched in his hand. "Mom," he called out, "look what we did today." She knelt as he reached her, and he showed her a drawing, rough, done in colored pencil. It was a stick figure man in a suit, standing in front of a group of people. Behind him was a police car. Above it, written in blocky handwriting, were the words, "Respect starts with how you see people." Rachel smiled, her throat tightening. "Did you draw that?" Aaron nodded proudly. "We watched part of the video in class. The teacher said he was really brave, and that we should always ask questions before we decide what someone is." That moment, quiet, unglamorous, was the ripple. Not the press conference, not the news coverage, but that. Back at police headquarters, Leon sat alone in his office as the late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows. The day had moved fast. Phone calls, media inquiries, policy meetings. But now, finally, he had a moment to himself. His desk was cluttered with folders, memos, and notes scribbled in the margins. But tucked in the corner was the small notebook he'd begun the night before. He opened it, flipped past his first entry, and started to write again. Power doesn't begin with a gun or a badge. It begins with choice. Every day we choose whether we will protect or control, serve or dominate, see or ignore. And every time we choose wrong, we break something that may never be repaired. He paused, letting the words settle, then added, "But every time we choose right, even when it costs us, we begin to build something that will last." He closed the notebook and leaned back, letting the silence settle around him. He wasn't naive. He knew the change wouldn't come easy. He knew there would be resistance, slow steps backward, mistakes still to be made. But he also knew this. Something had shifted. Not because he gave a speech, not because he was chief, but because the truth had been undeniable. And people, real people, had listened. Outside his window, he could see the city skyline cutting across the sky, strong and stubborn. The same city that had doubted him, that had cuffed him, that now looked to him. He stood, walked to the window, and rested a hand against the glass. Somewhere out there, a kid who looked like him just saw a different version of what was possible. Not a symbol, not a headline, but a man who had been judged, humiliated, and silenced, and chose to rise anyway. Leon turned back to his desk. There was still work to do, a department to reshape, a culture to rebuild, a future to write. And this time, it wouldn't be written in fear or silence. It would be written in action, and the city would remember where it started, on a quiet street with flashing lights and a man who refused to be broken. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.